Grunts have always been one of my favorite parts of Halo. Their goofy attitudes are excellent comic relief, especially in a universe that has so much darkness like Halo's. Grunts are funny and somewhat charming, there's no doubt about it. When people think about grunts, their minds probably immediately gravitate to goofy lines and funny Easter eggs.
Poor you! Stolen at the age of 6 and conscripted into the military.
Or perhaps that familiar and all too satisfying pop sound. Grunts, or Ungoi, spend most of their time being the butt end of the Halo universe's jokes. No one takes them seriously, and most of the times, no one gives them any respect. For the most part, the Ungoi are fun little goofballs. In-game, they exist to give the Covenant a cannon fodder level enemy, something even the least skilled of Halo players can dispatch with ease. Thematically, they're often used to lighten the mood with their squeaky voices and sometimes broken manners of speech. Grunts exude personality and humor, but what if I told you that humor isn't all the grunts are known for? That beneath that silly methane pack and goofy mask lies a race of sad and often tortured individuals. If you like in-depth lore videos like this one, don't forget to subscribe and click that little bell icon so you'll be notified when I make more. Before I get into the stories of any individuals, it's important to go over their history as a species. The Ungoi's homeworld, Balo, isn't the nicest place to live. Its atmosphere is composed of mostly methane, which is their form of oxygen. Yes, grunts breathe farts. Needless to say, without methane, they'd suffocate and die. As if smelling awful wasn't enough, their planet is very cold and mostly covered by ice caps. So Balo's surface isn't exactly a tropical oasis. To combat these harsh temperatures, they've evolved to have thick, chitinous skin that helps keep them from freezing to death. Grunts are technically a hyper-evolved form of crustacean. So think about that the next time you're eating a lobster dinner. However helpful this adaptation may be, it doesn't mean they don't feel the cold. Many grunts have froze to death thanks to the harsh weather of their home. Unfortunately for them, every other species of the Covenant breathe oxygen, much like humans do. So when a grunt is deployed off their homeworld, they have to constantly carry a supply of their atmosphere. Those goofy tanks they wear on their backs aren't just for show, they're the Ungoi's lifeline. Without those tanks, they would suffocate. Having a limited supply of breathable atmosphere is already problematic on its own, but combine that with a firefight where the opposing forces may be pinned down for hours or even days at a time, and there's no telling just how many grunts have suffocated to death simply because they ran out of breathable atmosphere in a sticky situation. Methane is also highly volatile and extremely flammable. This means that every time a grunt is forced to carry a methane tank, they're basically carrying an explosive strapped to their backs. An explosive that they need to survive. All that being said, these hardships pale in comparison to the misery that joining the Covenant would eventually bring. The Ungoi didn't even want to join the Covenant. They were forced. Thanks to their inferior technology, they simply couldn't fight back. When the Covenant arrived at their homeworld, many Ungoi hid. Those who weren't able to escape in time were forcefully subjugated. The poor little guys just didn't stand a chance. And they certainly weren't given a choice. Once folded into the Covenant, problems started to arise. You see, grunts despise jackals, and for good reason. The jackals, or Kigyar, notoriously mistreated the Ungoi. In the bird-like eyes of the Kigyar, the Ungoi, or gas suckers, as they're not so lovingly called, were an inferior species. They believed that the Ungoi were overbreeding and that their populations would soon overtake High Charity, the Covenant's planet-sized, multi-species city. Kind of like the Death Star, but built for habitation instead of destruction. The Ungoi are kind of like rabbits. They breed a lot. And this fear prompted the jackals to attempt to sterilize the Ungoi populations on High Charity, killing many Ungoi in the process. But the grunts had had enough. These killer Kigyar were the final straw. They rose up against their abusers and lashed out, violently and ferociously. Can you blame them? If a hostile party attempted to force mass sterilization onto the human race, well, I don't think we'd react too dissimilarly. The Ungoi were vicious in their retaliation, attacking more than just the Kigyar, but the elites, or Sanghili, and the prophets, or Sanshayum, as well. The little guys were tenacious and put up one hell of a fight, sending High Charity into a chaotic civil war, even giving the Sanghili, known for their honor-bound warrior-based culture, a run for their money. They'd been beaten down and abused enough. It was time for them to make a stand. To combat this sudden threat, the Sanshayum quickly appointed an arbiter to deal with the rebellion. His solution? Blast the surface of their homeworld with highly concentrated beams of superheated plasma, turning much of the planet's surface into glass. The Ungoi fighting within High Charity were forced to watch as their planet and its population were annihilated from orbit, with no chance of fighting back. Those that remained on High Charity were so overwhelmed with grief that they gave up their fight, as that was the only way the Arbiter would stop his relentless onslaught on their precious homeworld. However, their fighting prowess didn't go unnoticed. Many of the Sangheili had discovered a newfound respect for them, allowing them to fight alongside them in battle. To the Sangheili, being a warrior is everything, and the Ungoi had proven themselves as more than capable. Allowing you to fight by their side is the ultimate compliment from a Sangheili. So despite the horrific blow to the Ungoi species, it seemed their luck was beginning to turn around. They had actually been given a modicum of respect. Unfortunately, they were still the lowest men on the totem pole, and were still greatly disrespected. Certain individuals have had it worse than others. One of these individuals is Yayap, not to be confused with Yayap, the Destroyer, who has a much different story. Yayap was an oddity among Ungoi because he was exceptionally intelligent and a surprisingly good strategist, unbeknownst to his superior officers, of course. A Sangheili would generally never stop to ask an Ungoi what they thought. This would prove to be the bane of one particular elite's existence, an individual named Zuka Zamami. Yayap's first encounter with Zuka was purely happenstance. Leading a detachment of grunts into the Pillar of Autumn during the events of Halo CE, Yayap stumbled upon a grisly scene, piles of dead Ungoi littering the deck. Someone had been through here and had made quick work of his comrades. It was a disgusting and depressing sight to see his cohorts killed in such an undignifying way, but it didn't come as any surprise to Yayap. His kind was treated like cannon fodder, and it wasn't unusual for him to see members of his race in such a horrific state. A groan originating from somewhere within the pile of bodies interrupted his train of thought. He approached to investigate and found a Sangheili warrior clad in black armor. The elite had been knocked unconscious and was laying within the heap of bodies. Yayap stepped closer and examined the Sangheili's wounds and found they were somewhat trivial. He'd survive. Yayap thought for a moment. He was required by Covenant law to aid the elite, but what the Prophet hierarchs didn't know wouldn't kill them. Yayap's friend, Gaga, suddenly spoke, suggesting they leave the Sangheili where he laid, remarking that's what he'd do if the situations were reversed. Gaga certainly wasn't wrong. But Yayap was smart. He knew how to exploit the situation. He thought that they should save the elite. A big, heavy Sangheili like that would require a lot of muscle to carry out of here. He estimated at least 10 Ungoi. But why go through the trouble of carrying an ungrateful, disrespectful elite out of hostile territory? Well, Yayap figured that if they were busy carrying the Sangheili, they would have a more than reasonable excuse not to fight, and could therefore avoid any potential firefights, at least for the time being. Assaulting the human ship like this was a suicidal mission for the grunts. They'd surely get outnumbered and killed. Of course, the high-ranking shipmaster orchestrating this attack didn't care. They didn't value their lives. At the very least, killing the Ungoi would cost the humans ammo, a resource they didn't have an unlimited supply of, which, needless to say, would help the Covenant war effort in the long run. His compatriot thought for a moment, taking much longer than Yayap to fully understand the genius of this plan, before it finally clicked, and he agreed. His plan worked flawlessly. He and his contingent of grunts insisted the elite be evacuated from the Pillar of Autumn, and with that, Yayap had sidestepped a suicidal assault on hostile territory, and he and his pals would live to see another day. This would grant Yayap a few moments of reprieve. To celebrate his brief victory, he decided to take a nap, which, as we all know, is one of the Ungoi's favorite pastimes. But hey, they need their beauty sleep, and they need a lot of it because, let's be honest, they're a bit... As he slept, Yayap dreamt of his world. In his dream, he was walking through the marshy swamps of his homeland. He walked through the estuaries, past naturally occurring pillars of fire, a common sight in such a methane-rich environment. He weaved his way closer to a series of ancient stepping stones that led towards a hut made from reeds, the place where he grew up. Clearly missing his home, he enjoyed every moment of returning to it, even if it was only a dream. He awoke with a start as Gaga tugged on his arm. His friend looked slightly alarmed. Gaga informed him that the elite they had saved was summoning Yayap and wanted to speak with him ASAP. This couldn't be good. He jogged and worked his way towards where the elite was located. Yayap didn't even bother to get fully dressed, instead deciding to be fast so as not to displease the Sangheili by making him wait. In his experience, the Sangheili weren't particularly patient, especially not with their Ungoi subordinates. He nervously entered the room where the elite awaited him. He would soon learn the identity of this specific warrior, Zuka Zamami, a fairly high-ranking, black armor-clad special ops elite. Zuka had been informed of Yayap's insistence to evacuate his unconscious body, as well as Yayap himself and his grunty pals from the human's ship, and as far as Yayap was concerned, he wasn't going to be happy about it. He started to speak, He hoped to explain himself and potentially mitigate the wrath that would surely follow. But instead, Zuka interrupted him. He didn't call him here to reprimand him. He called him here to thank him, to commend him, and to transfer him. Yayap couldn't believe his ears. Zuka was giving him accolades. But he didn't want to be reassigned. He liked his unit. They weren't sent on missions often, and he had made friends with Gaga and the others. Yayap fell silent for a moment, before mustering up the courage to ask Zuka what unit he planned to transfer him to. When Zuka responded, Yayap's heart sank. He was being reassigned to Zuka's personal squad. Zuka's black armor was a clear indication of his high ranking in the Covenant's military. This meant he was a fanatic and would happily risk his life and the lives of his men if it meant furthering his holy mission. Yayap tried to protest, but it was no use. It had already been done. Whether he liked it or not, he was now Zuka's assistant. The elite's next goal was to make an appeal to the Council of Masters, a group of high-ranking elites and a minor prophet who acted as a governing body for the Covenant forces on the ring. His goal? To receive permission to hunt down and kill the human that had wounded him and knocked him unconscious prior to Yayap discovering him. This human was none other than John 117 himself, the Master Chief. Yayap couldn't believe it. Going after the demon was a suicide mission, and now Zuka was forcing Yayap to go along with him. This could only end in failure. At first, this plan of Zuka's would be rejected, but eventually the destruction that Master Chief was causing for the Covenant occupation on the ring would prove too great, and Zuka's goal to hunt the Spartan was approved. Zuka and Yayap's first altercation with the Chief didn't end well. If you've played through Halo CE, I'm sure you already know that the Chief makes his way through the events of the game relatively unscathed. But that wouldn't stop Zuka from relentlessly pursuing him and dragging poor Yayap along for the ride. Zuka developed a plan to spring a trap on the Chief. You see, Zuka had carefully slipped references to a map room periodically throughout the Covenant's BattleNet. If their transmissions were being tapped, which they absolutely were, these references to a map room would lead the Chief right to Zuka and the trap he had manufactured.
I've hacked into the Covenant battle network. They're actually broadcasting tactical data on unencrypted channels. We should show them who they're dealing with.
This trap was actually laid in this room, a very familiar location to anyone who's played through the Halo CE level, the Silent Cartographer. Zuka had positioned himself behind a Covenant cargo module and had ordered 2 hunters to hide in the shadows on either side of the room to hopefully catch the Chief unaware and get the drop on him. The hunters were waiting here and here. Well, that didn't work. One of the grunts stationed alongside Yayap foolishly took a shot at the Chief, a decision Yayap knew wouldn't end happily for the Ungoy. The Chief aimed his weapon at the grunt and pulled the trigger. The bullet impacted its head and sent a squirt of blood flying into Yayap's face. Zuka reached forward, grabbed Yayap's methane harness, and pulled him inside one of the cargo containers, ordering him to stay silent. The Chief passed right by them. Fortunately for them, he was completely unaware of their presence, which meant Yayap could live to see another day. For Zuka, this tactical retreat meant he had to face the Council of Masters again, and there was no telling how they'd react to his failures. But surely it wouldn't be good. If you've played Halo 2, then you saw what happened to the Arbiter, or Thelvadami as he was known before. He was branded a heretic and forced to undertake suicidal missions as an Arbiter, a shameful designation given to those who failed, but were considered too valuable to just be killed. If they had done that to such a high-ranking individual such as the Arbiter, there was no telling what they'd do to someone like Zuka, who was a nobody in comparison. Zuka was summoned by the council again, but this time when he entered the room, he found the severed head of one of the Sangheili delegates that had been a part of the group that decided to approve his little revenge quest. The minor prophet spoke to him and revealed that he had had the elite killed for his failings and placed his severed head for Zuka to see in order to send him a message. This was the cost of another failure. If he was unsuccessful in killing the demon again, this would be his fate. During all of this, the humans occupying the ring would eventually create a base of operations, a stronghold that Zuka and the Covenant presence would need to infiltrate and eliminate. This stronghold was given the designation Alpha Base. The tactical necessity of destroying the base would lead to even more misery for our somewhat diminutive friend, Yayap. Zuka seemed intent on formulating one suicidal plan after another. His next scheme was considerably more dangerous for Yayap than himself, of course. The idea was fairly simple. Place Yayap in an obvious location where the humans could find him so that he'd be taken prisoner. This way, Zuka would have an informant within the human stronghold. Yayap's job was to radio Zuka the moment he came in contact with the Master Chief, who he assumed was somewhere within the human's base of operations. Zuka was banking his life on this particular plan. He'd failed to kill the demon once already. If he failed again, he was as good as dead. Unfortunately for Zuka, he couldn't be more wrong about the Chief's location. John was busy doing other things. To sell the idea that Yayap had crashed or been shot down in battle, he was beaten and then, along with the remains of a ghost, dropped off not too far down a hill from where the UNSC had set up their base camp. Yayap wasn't at all confident in this ridiculous plan. He'd witnessed the humans gun down plenty of unarmed Covenant soldiers and didn't expect them to treat him any differently. Even if they did take him prisoner, he was pretty sure they'd discover he was in contact with his elite compatriot. But none of that mattered now. He couldn't say no to Zuka, and he was already in position. Part of him contemplated deserting his post and fleeing elsewhere onto the ring. His methane tank would deplete eventually, but at least he'd have the dignity of dying on his own terms and not by the hands of humans. But it was too late. A human patrol had started to approach the wreckage Yayap was placed with. As they grew closer, he fainted, which, in his mind, was the best option. It was best to appear unconscious. Much to his surprise, the humans hog-tied him, threw him into the back of a warthog, and proceeded back to their base. Zuka's insane plan was actually working. They hadn't killed him on sight. They'd taken Yayap as a prisoner. Supposedly, Yayap would eventually come into contact with Chief and radio for Zuka, an indication that he should then start a raid on the UNSC's base. The strange thing is, it's not exactly clear when the Chief would have come into contact with our little Ongoy pal. My best guess, Chief visited Alpha Base briefly between the Halo CE missions Assault on the Control Room and 343 Guilty Spark. It's possible that Chief made a pit stop before heading off to the swamps in the mission 343 Guilty Spark, but it's impossible to say for certain. That being said, Yayap isn't an idiot, so I don't imagine he misidentified a regular UNSC soldier or even an ODST as the demon himself. Perhaps Yayap lied. At this point, he didn't have much to lose, and he knew that Zuka's continued failures to find and kill the Chief would not be taken lightly by the Prophet aboard their ship, the Truth and Reconciliation. The raid had started thanks to Yayap indicating the Chief was in the base. As the battle between the UNSC forces and the Covenant raged on somewhere outside of the cell where Yayap was being held, he waited. That's all he really could do. Suddenly, a faint, glowing light entered the room and moved its way towards his cell. A voice came from thin air. It was Zuka's, asking if Yayap was there. He couldn't believe that his superior had actually come back for him. He had expected to rot here, now that Zuka was on the Chief's trail. Yayap wondered if this was a good thing or a bad thing. Maybe he'd be better off with the humans. Yayap stood and placed his head between the metal bars of his holding cell and greeted the disembodied voice. Zuka materialized before him. He'd been using an active camo module. Zuka wanted Yayap to lead him to the Chief. That's why he'd come back for him. Right, of course. Zuka didn't care about Yayap. Not really. He only cared about saving his own skin. Self-preservation. Well, that's one thing the two of them had in common. They didn't want to die. No sooner had Zuka asked Yayap to lead him to the Chief, had he formulated a clever plan to escape. Yayap would lead Zuka to a group of banshees that the human forces had seized under the guise that the demon was assigned to guard them. Zuka, obviously desperate, didn't even dispute the idea, so the two of them set off to the banshees. It wouldn't be too difficult to reach their objective amidst all the chaos of the raid, and even if things got dicey, Zuka was more than capable of providing a good defense. When Yayap and Zuka finally arrived at the banshees, the Chief was, needless to say, nowhere to be found. Zuka looked to his compatriot, realizing he'd been duped. All he wanted to know was why Yayap had lied to him. The answer was simple. Zuka knew how to pilot a banshee, and Yayap did not. During the skirmish that led to the banshees, Yayap had acquired a plasma pistol, and he intended to use it to get what he needed, and what he needed was a ride out of here. Yayap pointed the plasma pistol at Zuka's head and threatened to pull the trigger. Zuka said nothing. He just simply nodded, and the two of them hopped into the banshee. At this point, Zuka had no choice but to move on. He couldn't return to the Truth and Reconciliation and risk being decapitated like his superior before him. After what was surely the most awkward and uncomfortable banshee ride of all time, the two arrived at the wreckage of the Pillar of Autumn. The Covenant had taken control of the ship some time ago, but that didn't stop the UNSC from trying to take it back. This would be the most likely place to find the Chief, seeing as the humans seemed very intent on regaining control. Plus, Yayap was running dangerously low on methane, and a large group of Covenant forces like the one occupying the Pillar of Autumn would have plenty to supply him with. Zuka had no choice but to go along with this idea. He couldn't return to the Truth and Reconciliation. The Covenant forces within the Pillar of Autumn's wreckage had clearly been worn down by repeated UNSC assaults, and their newest problem, the parasitic alien disease, the Flood. They were desperate for troops. This is where Yayap would formulate yet another brilliant strategic plan. Zuka would approach the guards stationed at the Pillar's wreckage, claiming to be an entirely different elite officer, just in case Zuka's superiors were searching for him. Given that they were most likely desperate for more soldiers, especially someone as high a rank as Zuka, they wouldn't validate his identity. They needed all the soldiers they could get, and Yayap was convinced they'd accept Zuka's help without a second thought. And he was right. The Sanghelion guard was overjoyed to see them and put Zuka in charge of 20 jackals with Yayap as his second in command. Unfortunately for Yayap, Zuka's anxiety that someone would discover his true identity meant that he was too nervous to command his new contingent of jackals himself, and instead appointed Yayap to do it. Yayap knew that the jackals wouldn't take too kindly to the fact that they were being ordered around by an ungoi, a species they deemed lesser than their own, but they'd have to deal with it anyways. To make matters worse, the Flood had learned of the Pillar of Autumn's location and were intent on making their way in, something that Zuka would have had to deal with had he not sent Yayap in his place. So Yayap had to act as a commanding officer to a bunch of jackals that had no respect for him, and with their help, ensure that no Flood made it into the crashed ship. This meant everything had to be checked, including incoming supplies, in case they were hijacked by the Flood and being used as a Trojan horse. Using the might of his jackal compatriots, they checked and cleared a cargo container full of supplies, purging the Flood that had been hiding within. Once they'd taken care of the more pressing matters regarding the Flood, Zuka got back to scheming. This time, Yayap approved of his plan. Zuka wanted him to stay behind in the makeshift communications array that the Covenant had set up within the Pillar of Autumn, and listen to incoming reports regarding the Master Chief. This way, Yayap could listen in and determine where the Chief was, and therefore inform Zuka where he was going. Zuka could then lay another trap for the Master Chief, and simply wait for the Chief to come to him. At this point, Yayap was just happy to not be on the field where the demon could potentially kill him. Yayap did his part. He listened to the reports coming in, which weren't good, of course, and told Zuka where the Chief would be. Despite everything they'd been through, Yayap felt a strange affection for Zuka, a feeling he didn't really understand. So, when Zuka prepared to face off with the demon for potentially the last time, he wished him luck, and he truly meant it. In his mind, this was the last time he'd ever speak to Zuka. Not because he believed he'd be bested by the Chief, but because he believed they were all about to die. That's why the next thing he did was go on break, collect a supply of methane and food, hop into a ghost, and accelerate away from the Pillar's wreckage. For the first time in days since he saved Zuka, Yayap felt at peace. He drove his ghost as far as it would take him, further and further from the Pillar of Autumn's wreckage. The immense human construct shrank smaller and smaller on the horizon as Yayap accelerated away. Suddenly, off far in the distance from beyond him, he heard a series of dull thumps that reverberated through his skull. He turned and looked back towards the human ship and watched as pillars of flame erupted from inside, exploding outward and creating a sight not too dissimilar to the one he dreamt of not so long ago, the naturally occurring fiery plumes that he associated with home. The Chief had detonated the fusion reactors inside the Pillar of Autumn, causing the ship's reactors to go critical. Finally, in a blaze of glory, the ship erupted, creating a blinding explosion as bright as the sun, large enough to tear through the ring and send a shockwave of immeasurable proportions deep into space. It's impossible to say if Yayap watched as the pieces of the ring flung into itself, splintering the structure into continent-sized pieces, or if the superheated energy from the detonation vaporized him immediately. But one thing is for certain, Yayap watched as the world he stood on ended.
Did anyone else make it?
Scanning. Just dust and echoes.
If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe and share it with your friends. This was a ton of fun to make. I really do love the grunts. They're such a fun and tragic aspect of Halo's lore. The duality they represent makes them one of my favorite parts of the Halo universe. Let me know if there are any other subjects you'd like me to cover. I've got plenty of other ideas, but I'd love to hear what you think. Thanks for watching, and if you'll excuse me, I'm gonna go play some Halo.